think that this balance of perspective is amazing. So although you might not feel that you have that whatever, I get so much value out of what you say, and so much like heart. I've seen Dave make people cry a few times before, just because
like, it's
of his
like
absolute passion
you make
and the
people
realness
cry.
of it. It's true. It's true. I've nearly shed a tear. Yeah, we've got Carmen saying guilty, so we've got someone on this chat that you have made cry before with your raw passion. So it's a
Is this like going to be like a thing? Who's Dave Gannon made cry without?
Yeah. You'll know if you've done a good job at the end of this chat if we have a few tears coming back. So yeah. Anyway, that managed to fill the time. So now a little introduction. David Andrew Gannon is an Afghan veteran who served with the UK Works Royal Engineers as a Marines expert on both his tours, working on infrastructure projects across the country. So basically, we have a veteran with us today who has experienced firsthand how conflict affects the environment. I just want to basically, Dave, you can talk for about half an hour.
Yes, just let me know when to shut up.
Yeah, I will let you know. And unlike previous weeks, for those who have joined us before, Dave won't be doing a screen share. He's just going to be talking, which is awesome. So I might interject with some questions or some of your guys' questions throughout. So please write questions whenever you feel them. If you have any issues with, understanding, or if something's happening technically that is altering the way that you're hearing this, then please let us know in the chat and we'll try and help you out. But yeah, I think I just want to start Dave talking by asking, did you, when you were signing up for the military, did you consider the environment?
No, not at all. I mean, it's like, there's a hole in the ozone layer. Make sure you don't buy the fridges that give off CFCs. That was pretty much my sort of like, my environmental knowledge and how much I actually cared about the environment, because global warming wasn't really that. They changed how spray fresheners were. They didn't have any chlorofluorocarbons in them anymore. And there's catalytic converters, and diesel was still good at the time. So that was like my actual thoughts on the environment before then. It just didn't even come into my stratosphere at all. Really didn't, like. So next.
Yeah. So, and I think as well, just something to go on is how much has because you obviously signed up willing and wanting to join the army, and now you are part of Veterans for Peace. So can you maybe just talk us through that change of...
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk. So I mean, when I joined the military, it was there's like ethnic cleansing and stuff going on in places like there's been stuff going on in Kosovo, Bosnia, and like Tony Blair done his humanitarian interventionist war doctrine. And it was like this whole thing about we go out and we be like, sort of, Team America, well, police, bad people do bad things. So what we do is that we're supposed to go out there and protect everyone and save the world. And, it was went with Bosnia, and then Kosovo came into it. There's a big one with that. And then there was a large operation in Sierra Leone. And I actually went to join the parachute regiment originally, because the parachute regiment had been involved in all these things. And basically I didn't make the cut because I got injured. And parachute regiment's like pretty hard to get into. And like, you get injured, you're screwed, basically. Some people get over it, some people don't, and I didn't really. And then I transferred to the Royal Engineers. And in the Royal Engineers, I ended up doing a passes of design trade assessment thing, where you did like 6 weeks of to see if you were clever That basically is what they did. And like, you know, the assessors for 6 weeks on English, maths, science, IT, that sort of stuff, took us around all these different design trades and that, see which ones we liked. And then we picked the trade from design spectrum, where you could have said, I don't want to do that, I want to do an artisan one, like electrician or fitter. And I picked this really weird trade called construction materials technician. And what construction materials technicians did was that they did, well, first, before we even did that, we did combat engineering, which is where like all engineers do this combat engineering phase before they pick a trade. So you do your basic training, 12 weeks, whatever, of learning to be a soldier, and they'll teach you all the soldier things, like, you know, how to kill people and stuff like that. And when I say how to kill people, it's like some bayonet training. And I thought, did they do bayonet training at that stage? I came, because I transferred over, I just walked into the combat engineering side, because we did a little bit more on that side than you normally would. But you basically learn how to do point shooting and stuff like that, march, you know, and do section attacks and be able to work in a section, you know, and use these like sort of tactics and that. And then you do your combat engineering training, which is like you do things like bridge building, basic construction techniques. So you learn how to like sort of use tools and what all the tools are for, and how to be a mate to all these people. And then you do field fortifications, where you learn how to, you know, dig trenches, build all these big, like, you know, World War II style trenches and all that sort of stuff. You did minefield clearance and mine warfare, so you learn how to plant mines and how to clear them. And I was one of the last people to do before the Kyoto Agreement, which is kicking in. And the Kyoto Agreement is where we couldn't do anti-personnel mines anymore. And I was one of the last classes to actually get trained on how to set booby traps, you know, and how to weaponize a house, basically, which they sort of stopped doing, teaching the use of booby traps and how to booby trap a house. Shortly after that, and we did well, to do watermanship and water pure what was it called, like water purification. So we learned how to create potable water from river water and set up water points for brigades and things. So it's quite useful stuff in there. And we've been having discussions about this sort of stuff. Should the infantry be amalgamated with the engineers to do all stuff like, you know, flood defence and all these things? And like, there's some like really useful skills that you learned in the engineers. Well, basically what it was is that booby trap laying, and that is that you got trained to do it when you're in the engineers, using a thing called combination switch, which we stopped using after Kyoto came in, because basically it was against anti-personnel mines. That's from the chat there saying, why didn't know about the Kyoto, but that's what happened. So there's useful skills in there. And then what you did this trade training. You could be an artisan trade, a driver, or an artisan trade like, you know, a bricklayer or electrician or a fitter. And some of these trades are really good, actually. They are really, really good. And there's design trades, which is like the top 5% of the army would go in if they did all these tests. We did these tests and I passed enough, and I decided to be this construction materials technician. Now, construction materials technician did ground investigations. So you'd do these, you'd learn to dig, you know, you'd learn to like go to a site. And what you do is that you'd do in situ tests and which is like where you do it there and there in the ground. And you'd also do sampling for tests in the laboratory to basically create the engineering figures by which people built the buildings off and did the designs. So that's what the ground investigation side is. So it involved like, you know, in situ testing, use of like drilling rigs and stuff like that, you know, samples of soils, disturbed where it's just been smashed up, or undisturbed where it's like, you know, you take sections of the ground out in the state that it's at. Quite complex stuff, just that. And then obviously if you do the actual testing and analysis side of it, for like the soils and stuff and rocks or what have you, that's another technical aspect again, and this is how you create your figures. But we also did like quarrying, and we learned all about quarrying. We learned how to set up and manage quarries. You know, we learned about the analysis, quality control, and design of like aggregate mixes, you know, and of like, you know, the types of like, you know, gravel that you put on the floor when you make roads. Well, they're all made in different mixes and stuff. So we had to learn how to do that and how to test them all and all this sort of stuff and run laboratories around that. And then we did concrete technology, which is like sort of this stuff sort of combined. But, you know, we learned how to design the concrete that you put in an airfield and how much you would need. We also did, and there's like special chemicals you put in to make the concrete porous so that like it soaks up water quicker, like on airfields. Yeah, there was, right. So during the entire thing, when you're in the UK, there was a lot of environmental safety training provided on this. You become aware of all the environmental effects in the military there is in the UK. There is like a lot of spec, and it just all came in a lot later. It came in later because in the 70s and 90s there wasn't, but it all got brought in. Because, like, for example, we used to work when we were doing the asphalt testing. We used to use this stuff called dichloroethane. I think that's the actual name of it, like dike we used to call it, and people used to drink it, you know, as like an initiation, but it's carcinogenic. And like, so, but you had to work with it when you were actually doing analysis of asphalts and like tarmac adams and stuff like that, you know, because you did asphalt design as so part of like the pavement design and testing, you know. So the health and safety and cost side was actually very heavy. We did work with some stuff that like used radioactive elements as well. There was like a device, I can't remember the name of it now, but you had a box, you dug a hole in the floor, you put the box over it, you rammed the friggin' probe in, and it gave you a load of engineering figures by using a radioactive element to like basically determine like the moisture content, you know, and the density of the ground in situ. There's some good bits of kit there, like it's probably old now. But that was like the technical background that we had, and I ended up going to a team called after being in the field army for a bit and doing some testing and like doing different types of jobs and that around this work. I got sent to 530 Specialist Team Royal Engineers, materials, which is like the whole labs there are down in Chilwell, and the part of a group called 170 Infra Support Group, which is like, these are the people that have just built the Nightingale hospitals for the NHS now, you know, that team, that design team. And they'd go in, they do design, the designs for like military constructions, and then they'd oversee the management of them as well, and they do the liaison with civilian contractors and like. And this unit, you're basically on 2 hours notice. Well, you're on 2 weeks notice to move pretty much permanently. It was on high readiness, and you got sent out in pairs. So like, there's always somebody in theatre somewhere, you know. So there was a unit that was like permanently on deployment in multiple countries, and I trained to be a class 1 in the end, which, you know, which was a high level one. And basically at the end of it, I was like, on my last tour I was managing three concrete batching plants. No, my first tour I was managing 3 concrete batching plants, and I was helping to set up their labs and things. And I worked on that, and then when I come back I was in charge of materials, basically the task force Helmand, which was all the and quality assurance and testing. But you know, they didn't really want to test anything too rigorously, if I'm honest. There's barriers there, basically because it's done by private contractors, and it's more sort of a bit more beneficial if they weren't scrutinized too much, which I did scrutinize. And then what I found is that I wouldn't get access to things, really? To be fair. If you know, because, you know, yeah, no, seriously. There was a job, an expansion for Camp Bastion, And we were working on that, and they were building these concrete sangars. And this is what, like, a sangha is basically a big tower, and then you have the walls going around the towers and that. And what happened is that, like, I went on site and looked at some of these sangars, and like one of them looked like a fucking arrow. That's the best way I could describe it, pardon my French. And what it is that when you're making concrete, 1% of air voids equals a loss of strength of 5 newtons. Now that doesn't really mean anything to anybody there unless they actually do engineer out in the own stuff, they do actually engineering stuff, but like, and work with concrete. But the concrete that was being used was 40 Newton concrete. It was specified that for it to make strength, for it's basically, it's going to have, like, you could have like a rocket propelled grenade fired at it. You had to be able to stop that. So they were spec'd for 40 newtons. So if you've got something that looks like, you know, it's got like 2% air voids in it, you know, it's, what was it, 30 newtons? But either way, it's like, you know, if it's got 10%, it's like got like, you know, 2% air voids in it. It goes from being like 40 to 30 or 30 to 20, do you know what I mean? And this was 10 years ago, but like, you know, you could see that, like, so then when I basically wouldn't sign something off and said it should be torn down, I didn't really get on that site again. It's just quite funny.
And is it mostly private contractors doing all the scrutiny of and holding the UK government accountable and all the teams accountable, both when it comes to the general?
So what was happening was that UK Works. Well, so what UK Works Group did is that UK Works Group would go and look at a job, and then what it would do was that it would come up with like some sort of a design or reconnaissance to be done on it, on the area that needs to be done. A design specification would be put out, and then you put the contract out to tender, and then the civilian contractors that were floating about would then bid for this contract. So what would happen was that, like, they bid for a contract that, you know, inevitably the cheapest person would win at one point, you know, but and then what did happen was that when Bastion was a lot smaller on my first tour, we didn't have our own laboratory in the military. We used one of the contractors' labs, and like we worked out of that. And then, like, when the contractors come up with their own sort of their own labs and that, which we helped set up, we'd sort of go into their labs and work with them and look at the stuff and work quite closely. Then as it got bigger, it moved from like quality control, and then there was more trust put in these contractors to quality assurance, where you just test their testers. But when you're thinking about how much money was involved, it was like sort of, you know, you're just assessing what people are putting in front of you, and for you to actually properly test that, and that was nigh on impossible. It's nigh on impossible. And you know, in terms of like the actual environmental safety measures and that, in places like Camp Bastion, it was literally a desert. And like, you know, you know, if you look at it, and they basically just dug up the desert, shaped it, and put flat the camp on it. And you know, you can go online, you can Google Camp Bastion, you can see images of it. But it was literally plonked in the middle of nowhere. If you want to talk about the scales of like how much, like, if we're talking carbon footprint stuff, and I mean, you've got the boffins before I go on about proper figures, but when you talk about deploying somebody on operations and that, or deploying operations, you know, initially, you've either, to get the equipment into an area to operate, you've either got to fly it in or you've got to drive it in. And what's in places like Afghanistan, let's see, I'm just going to read some of the comments. One thing's perspective. Right, I'll get back onto the Veterans for Peace stuff and the anti-war stuff in a minute. I've really got anywhere to go, so like, I'm quite happy to talk on that. Like, but what they do is, let's say if they wanted to fly any equipment in, well, they wanted to bring any equipment in, they had to drive it. And we're talking, this is when Afghanistan was built, when Bastion was built, you'd have to drive it in through convoy, in which case these convoys would occasionally get hit and you wouldn't get the materials that you needed anyway. But the amount of diesel in like whatever vehicles were there that was getting chewed out just to move stuff must have been phenomenal, because these were not small vehicles. And we're talking about tanks being moved and, well, you know, armored personnel carriers being moved. I think it was tanks initially, but then that just got chinned off because they don't really work in an insurgency. But you know, there's plenty of like the likes of the Mastiffs. They are huge armored personnel carriers. They are not exactly the most like, just because of the weight of them, they drink juice beyond. And you can go on, you can Google Mastiffs, you know, UK British Army Mastiffs. You can see the size of these vehicles. Land Rovers are like, these like 2.5 litre diesel engines, right? And that was like probably one of the smallest vehicles out there. So, you know, and these are everywhere. And these camps operate like mini cities. He's talking about like if you bringing in like food supplies or anything like that. Well, in Camp Bastion at one point, they didn't even have a water well there. So they didn't have any water being made on site. So it was all being flown in, and it was all in plastic bottles. I think there's like some potable stuff was being done, but I don't know how they were doing it. I think there's water that you could wash with, but you couldn't drink with it. And they managed to get that from a well in the ground, but they didn't have a processing plant for drinking. So like what you'd have people flying in just water, but then you'd also have like food rations. In places like Bastion, it was in the middle of the desert and that, there's not a lot of crops grown there. Pretty much everything was flown in. And, you know, I think it's flown in from like places like, you know, Pakistan, like, you know, Qatar, Jordan, you know, like, or wherever, like, there's anywhere that was like remotely friendly country that was like sort of next to it. You'd have huge, I mean, the traffic, I mean, Camp Bastion had its own airfield. And like, it was relatively busy. I was there when they upgraded the runway from an aggregate dirt one to an actual proper concrete one. And you know, the amount of money. And by the way, concrete itself is one of the most carbon heavy products that, you know, that can get pushed. I think the majority of the UK's like sort of carbon footprint comes from the construction industry, and it's through cement production. So, you know, it's so, you know, the amount of like concrete that got put into that, it's just huge. And then there's all like, you know, there was the helicopter air landing strips that got built, huge. So, you know, you're talking about building a scratch built a city within like, you know, like 6 years or something. Kandahar itself, which was just basically a large air base, had so much traffic, cars, like, you know, smallest one being a 2.5 litre engine. And then obviously the CAF was like dwarfed Bastion in the amount of stuff that it needed in terms of food and supplies and all that, because there's no way to like grow crops or anything like that in Afghanistan. It just, you know, if there was farmland, it wasn't particularly friendly. What I was going to say is that, like, you know, the POL points, the petrol, oil and lubrication points, they call it, basically your fuel depots. I mean, when they originally got set up, some of these, they were like done in the 50s or something, you know, in the likes of CAF. And, you know, and what it would be is that, like, you know, whereas like there is strict regulations on how you deliver fuel and here in the UK, over there, it was just plonked on top of whatever. And if anything spilt on the floor, it just goes into the ground. And eventually, if you know anything about like how aquifers get polluted, is that, you know, oil and POL and diesel can drain through the ground up until the point where it hits a water aquifer, and it can poison an entire aquifer. In case anyone doesn't know what an aquifer is, which I'm pretty sure everybody does, is that in our geology, we have layers of soil, then layers of rock, and then what happens is that you can hit a point where there's the water table and you can have like a layer of like clean water that's underground. You know, and some of this can be polluted. If that's polluted, it's the reason why fracking is like, you know, dangerous, and like, you know, and how it's a massive pollutant, because there's a chance that it can poison the groundwater itself. This is why fracking's bad. This is from someone who's done rock drilling. And yes, oh right, so this is actually quite a good one, about, you know, the military interventions, what I think the armed force should be used for. We'll talk about that. But what I was going to say is that they can, when you talk about the construction, the amount of waste in construction in general is massive. Now, there's no real regulations there because there's nowhere to get rid of waste. So when you have like rubbish or plastic from rations, field rations come in plastic and that, well, foil packets, shit, do you know what I mean? You know, in certain places and that, like, you know, people have got nowhere to put the shit in some of the smaller camps or smaller outposts. And like, you know, any type of like waste stuff from like, because even your bullets year round, you know, they come in like, you know, bandoliers, they're plastic, you can use them, but eventually they get lashed because there's so many. But what would happen in Bastion is that pretty much all the rubbish would get put into a large burn pit and cooked. They just burn it. They burn it on the ground, these huge piles, and they just pump shit up into the sky. It's not particularly healthy. That was what they did with the waste in Camp Bastion. So it's like a small cities where the waste just getting burnt. That was like that.
Now, is that what's happening? Is that pretty much abandoned, or all that?
Yeah, well, I think 𝗗𝗂𝗃𝗃 is like got handed over. They turned the name of some bit to Camp 𝗗𝗂𝗃, and the Afghan National Security Forces and that like are sort of floating around there. There's a place, you know, and they took over part of it, but a lot of this has been abandoned now. There's actually pictures on the internet, and it looks at Camp Bastion now, and it's how the deserts claimed it. And what's quite sort of tragic is about the amount of money that got poured into this place, the amount of stuff that got built there. I mean, the stuff was built in tents, then it became porta cabins. And all your electricity, by the way, I'm going to say, is ran from diesel generators. It's not like they thought, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll put some, you know, solar panels up in these relatively safe areas. Partially because, like, some of the solar panels could be vulnerable to being mortared, to be fair. So there's reasons for it, but they haven't, like, come up with small-scale solutions to, like, sort of help charge low-level things using solar, which is something that they could have worked on, but they didn't. So everything's run by diesel. So you've got diesel generators going pretty much 24/7 as well, powering a city. So the amount of fuel it must have took to keep all, and that was like one place to keep all these places going. Were the Afghan soldiers respectful of their environment? No, they were not. They weren't respectful of their environment because their lives are so short and brutal, like the majority of Afghanistan. When people live short, brutal lives, and they're just basically trying to live from day to day, you know, putting the card into the card bin when there isn't a card recycling facility because your country has no infrastructure is not a priority. It's not. I mean, there's a lot of people who just I mean, you know, they just defecate anywhere, to be honest. You know, not within Camp Bastion itself, because there's a degree of training, but, you know, sanitary conditions and the sanitary behaviour of some of the natives and that. And I sound very like, this is where I sound very British colonialist here. It was very poor, and it's not their fault. It's like, you know, they've come from like, they might have come from like being in basically a mud hut where there's no real actual health and sanitation conditions. And like, you know, they'd literally just crap in the river, or there'd be like, you know, a hole in the ground somewhere that they'd go and use, or a bucket. You know, I mean, if you were going to Kabul's more of an actual city. You know, and you get places that are like more like cities and have plumbing and stuff like that. But a lot of people that had come from like, you know, to come and work in Camp Bastion, because there's a lot of the native Afghan people, like Well, yeah, I mean, from all over, you had people from Afghan coming all over and actually working on these constructions. It wasn't just soldiers, it was civilians as well. I worked with a lot of Afghan civilians, and you know what? I thought they were great. They were culturally different. They did have values, but they weren't bad people by any stretch. Child protection there is like proper dubious. That is something which is pretty prevalent throughout the entire Middle East, to be honest. But again, these people had come from quite basic places, and they learned how to build on site because you taught them and other people taught them. But they had families at home and they were separated. They were living in where they were living in, say, like a porter cabin if they were lucky, or in some sort of a tent if they were unlucky on the camp. There'd be like, I don't know, like 10 men in a room. Are the
we
UK
need to come
trying
back to the anti-war
Yeah.
bit, how you joined Veterans for Peace as well at some point.
Yeah, well, I'll just answer this one quickly on the environment, because I've sort of covered a lot of stuff about disposal and rubbish and that, and burning and...
You've given us a great image of what...
Yeah, so it was the UK Army trying to rectify environmental damage they caused there. I mean, so they had pollution survey teams in 530 STRE, and I'm not gonna lie, right? They actually tried their best to minimise environmental damage where possible. So if they built fuel points and stuff like that, they did them to a high spec. I'll say that. They did them to a high spec, and they built stuff to contain fuel spillages and stuff like that. And the military itself is actually pretty good in camps and stuff like that. Where there's been environmental damage will be where there was no security or safety to put a consideration for it. So even if they wanted, so if they didn't need environmental damage in, say, somewhere like 𝗗𝗂𝗓𝗂, which is like worse than the Wild West now, right? Even if they wanted to rectify any environmental damage, you couldn't safely do it anyway. It would be, and I'm not saying that like at some point in the future, are we going to look at that? I don't know, because what happened in Afghanistan is that we destroyed the infrastructure, what little infrastructure there was, and we got rid of the stability in that country. Now, a country only starts to develop its education and societies when people stop shooting at each other. So when you have even if it's a tyrannical government where there is an open warfare is better than being in a lawless society where there is open warfare. People might contest that, but people have this romantic vision of like revolutions, creating some sort of a freedom thing and this, that, and the other. But Cuba's like a minority country. Literally. And for Cuba to put its system in place, they had to be relatively brutal at the beginning to establish power and establish dominance, so they could do what changes that they wanted to make. But I don't support revolution, violent revolution, full stop, because it normally ends up being one gang of bastards being ousted and it's another gang of bastards coming in. So I can go back to Veterans for Peace. I know people want to ask about Veterans for Peace. Do you want to just like take questions and stuff now?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is everyone happy with that? Does anybody want me to elaborate on anything else, or do you want me to just do the questions on what do I think the army should be for? How did I get to Veterans for Peace?
Yeah, and elaborate. I'm sure you'll elaborate in your own way anyway, and we can ask more questions from there. So.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, I can move back. So I'll go back to why did I join Veterans for Peace? So when I was in the military, I'm from Liverpool, so I'm you're a socialist because that's what you're supposed to be, and it's pretty tribal, and we were told the idea of socialism is that like people pay taxes to make sure that people that are like, poor and can't help themselves are supported by the government. Do you know what I mean? That was pretty much like sort of my reasons for my politics initially. But I joined the military as a point of like duty, because I thought we were stopping these things like ethnic cleansing and stuff like that. And we're going to do a lot of real humanitarian stuff, and instead humanitarian interventionist warfare just gets abused, and it turns into something else. It turns into an excuse for imperialism. So but I'll come back to that. But basically, I joined because I wanted to help people. That's why I joined. My granddad was in the army. My granddad was in the 8th Army, and was in the North Africa campaign, and in the Italian campaign in the General Service Corps as a driver. But if you read about the 8th Army in North Africa and the Italian campaign, and they're called the dED'S, which is quite funny. But these are like really long and brutal, bloody conflicts where these units didn't have any respite for 3 years, and I knew came to grasp what my granddad could have seen recently. Do you know what I mean? And I joined the service. I joined the Territorial Army when he was still alive, because I thought, the army, I thought, if you serve your country, and like I'm thinking like helping people, by the way, it's like a point of duty, it's a point of honor. And I did believe that everyone should have done this, everyone should have joined the service or done something, to pay something forward, because and servitude, I saw on it the servitude of the state, which is by de facto the people. It's not the case, but and then when I was in the service, and these wars started to go on, I listened to guys like Tony Benn, because Tony Benn was good, because Tony Benn was like the king of socialism. Do you know what I mean? So listen to his, I heard his anti-war speech over Iraq, and I watched the Iraq protests going on, and I was like, and I didn't think these people who were protesting against the Iraq war were against the soldiers at any point. I didn't think that. I thought, people like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and all these groups are fighting a war, but on a different front. Do you know what I mean? And it's up to the people of the country to determine whether the places that soldiers get sent to, it's up to the people to basically make sure that soldiers are sent to the right places or not to anywhere at all. It's up to the electorate to do that by electing in the right government. So Tony Benn did his anti-war speeches and that. Dr. David Kelly got killed. Robin Cook hung himself, apparently. Do you know what I mean? And you're watching all these events around Iraq, and then there was but also there was the whole thing about the invasion of Iraq, where the UN inspectors had 2 weeks to finish their weapons inspections, and they weren't allowed to. And that didn't sit right with me. Do you know what I mean? And then I read a book called Stupid White Men by a guy called Michael Moore, and it was about the presidential election where George Bush got in the first time. And I read this follow-up, where Dude, Where's My Country? Shortly after the invasion of Iraq, and I was still I was in the engineers at that point, but I didn't deploy to Iraq. But it talked about situations around that, and but what these books talked about was contracts. Do you know what I mean? It talked a lot about contracts and how there's a monetary incentive for these wars to happen along Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. If anybody hasn't seen the film Vice yet, watch the film Vice, because that says a lot about what happened in Iraq and how wars are done. There's another good documentary called Why We Fight, which is worth watching, which I watched on my second tour, which was starts with General Eisenhower giving his leaving speech when he'd done his second term as president, warning against the military-industrial complex. And they talk about the military-industrial complex that went into Iraq and how much contractors were getting paid there. And then I was seeing it myself live in Afghanistan. And it's like fortunes. this privatization, this thing. And I also listened to a lot of Noam Chomsky. I read a lot of his stuff, and I was listening to Noam Chomsky on YouTube and watching, you know, any documentaries or any talks that he had. And I was learning about free market economics through him and the military industrial complex just by listening to YouTube. And I got introduced to this from Michael Moore's book. And the other film, Fahrenheit 9/11, that's another one. And we were watching this stuff, you know, while we were in the service. And, you know, on my second tour, it was like nobody believed that we were doing anything good there. Nobody believed in the war. Nobody thought it was even winnable, because it was like we had the conversation of, okay, why did we come out here? Well, we came out here to kill bin Laden. Well, you know, all right, so we kill him, then fucking what? And that was basically the conversation. And it was like, what will that change? So he's dead. Is everyone going to all of a sudden, the Taliban, or who we were calling them at the time, but, you know, it's probably a lot of them are just disgruntled citizens, and the like. And are they just going to down tools because we've said, you know, Osama's dead now, that's it, it's over, we won, woohoo, and they're just stop? No, that was never going to happen. And they kept changing the remit for, you know, they had to put an actual, like a bulletin explaining that we were there to help put in a stable government to Afghanistan. And there's this thing called mission creep, which I don't know if anybody here will have heard of it, but it's like, this is something that's like militaries are scared of, is mission creep. And you can get it yourself, where you start out doing one thing and then, you know, you end up doing something completely different to what you came into. And Afghanistan and Iraq were like the biggest mission creep freaking issues going, because, you know, get rid of Saddam, oh yeah, everyone's going to be free and everything's going to work now. No, it isn't. It never was. But then when you look at like the military planners, you know, and you look into that sort of stuff, and you look at like the contractors and what they were actually really trying to achieve, is, you know, the perpetual state. It was like, get the oil, get the mining rights. Afghanistan's now got mines that are run by private companies for the mineral wealth, and, you know, so that's like sort of really what that was about. And when you get to understand,
oil was a big incentive for the war.
Yeah, oil for Iraq, you know, and everything around the oil. And then what happens when you realise that these wars are basically economically driven, and they're driven to increase the profits, the shareholder profits for these multinational, unaccountable companies like Genstar, Dyncorp, Serco, and a lot of these like involved in the medical industry. If anyone's looking at that as well, when you start looking at like how this is working, and then you start thinking about the logic as to why you invaded, it made no sense. I mean, even like Libya killing Gaddafi just didn't achieve anything; just achieved chaos. We now have the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, and that's just like a fundamentalist state, something that we were supposed to be stopping, and it just created it instead, you know. And what there is, this is perpetual state of war going on at the moment, which is interesting. And, you know, the amount of, and if you want to talk about environmental costs, I mean, you know, the amount of, like, you know, the chemicals that are involved in making explosives are like not nice. But also when you blow something up, anything that's bad in that building, it just goes into the atmosphere and goes into the environment as well. But what these war zones, these impossible wars that are never ending, have created is a permanent market to drop ordnance. It's a permanent reason to have, you know, draconian anti-terror laws that affect civil liberties. It's a permanent reason, you know, to have operations in these areas. And it's not about success now. It's about how much money you can extract from the public purse and put into the private sector. So, you know, that's another thing, like, you know, that it is. I think it's just about, it's a created market. It's an artificially created market now, and I think they like it that way. That's my opinion, you know. But if they win in the Middle East, then who are they going to sell bombs to? So to me, so I ended up getting into the anti-war movement because I was anti-war when I was in, and then when I got injured and I left, and then there's like loads of like Stockholm syndrome while you're in the service. And when I left, and I thought it was abhorrent, I thought it's not fair on guys who are in these war zones, fighting in these war zones, and no one can speak for them. No one's speaking for them. So I seen Ben Griffin do a speech online, and it was and he's and it was like, why, and it was came up on YouTube on a stream, and it was why I won't fight for Queen and country. And this guy was ex-parachute regiment, ex-SAS, and he did the most prolific anti-war speech I have ever heard, right? And he just absolutely slated and ripped apart the entire system and everything about it. But this is like one of their gods. This is somebody who's supposed to be one of their chosen men, absolutely ripping this system apart. And he said everything that I believed. And then I seen it was Veterans for Peace, so I signed onto a mailing list for Veterans for Peace. Then I got speaking to people, and then, you know, the stuff with Corbyn came along, and I was talking to Joe Glenton at the time, and we decided to like run a campaign where veterans would go out, and my cat wants to get in because he wants some food. Does anyone want to see my cat? Just like, this is like quite geeky, but there's Mr. Whiskers. There you go. He's a good boy. So this is going to get interesting as I actually keep talking whilst I give him some dinner. So I says I ended up like meeting up.
Yeah, I've just got time to just finish off how you joined, and then
you know, I ended up like going into this group and doing like, you know, some anti-war talks and protests with them and that. And then we ended up doing, Mick Dixon made a film called War School. We ended up doing some screenings and showings of that and going off and talking when there's a Syria bombing, because I was involved in the Labour movement and you was involved in Veterans for Peace, I'd speak on some of these platforms against the bombing. So that was sort of how I got into it, because, you know, war is not the solution to problems we face in the 21st century. Military interventions. Okay, so I'll go to that. I think people who are going to join the military, what they need to do is to do the research. I've got a document there that I've put together that people have read.
This question out before you start.
The
question is, if you could tell one thing to prospective recruits, people thinking of joining the military for the sake of their patriotic duty, what is the advice you would give to them?
I would say, watch the film War School first. Watch the film War School, the Mick Dixon film War School. Watch that, and then watch Ben Griffin's talk on the making of a British soldier. Watch that.
Carmen's providing these links in the chat now as well, so thank you, Carmen. Yeah.
There's a report called the First Ambush by Veterans for Peace, which talks about the effects of employment and training within the military, and that's based on numerous papers, and it's been compiled together into a report. Read that, and if you do them couple of things and you know what you're getting into, then what I would say is best of luck to you and Godspeed. Because I believed in informed consent, and if people can, you know what they're getting into, can understand what they're getting into. Also, there's a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman who did a book called On Killing, and he does some interviews talking about the effects of people being trained to kill. and they studied it in the States, and it's very like open. It's not like it's top secret. It's not good for you. But I would say that you need to understand what you're getting into. You need to guard yourself from, like, understand you are being conditioned and it's going to change you. And, you know, if you still want to do it, go and do it. Because if you watch all that stuff and you still want to do it, then nothing's going to stop you. But at least you know, at least you're aware of it. I think it's 𝗲𝗂𝗓𝗓 done a talk on the Lucifer effect, what makes good people do evil things, what makes good people evil. So 𝗲𝗂𝗓𝗓, the Lucifer effect, watch the lecture on that as well, so that you make decisions that are decent while you're in there and you're aware of how groupthink works and what can go wrong and how war crimes happen. I think that's it. That's all I've got to say on that, really, to be honest.
Yeah, and just to like summarize that and finish on, like, do you think you weren't given the right information when you signed up?
I don't think I knew what I was getting into. The romanticized vision, I didn't fully. Whether, if I knew all that I knew now, would I still have joined? Possibly, but my attitude would have been different, and I would have done things to guard my mental health while I was in there. You know, so it's like, if I knew what was happening, I probably would have made better decisions. I would have handled it better. So, you know, I think in terms of like Afghanistan and Iraq and that, you know, or going to Afghanistan, I don't think anything good came from going there, and I really mean, you know, I really mean that.
For you, or for the whole operation?
I think for everything, really, if I'm honest. But what I will say is that they were going to go anyway. And was it better that I was there than somebody who either couldn't handle it or was actually a proper bad guy? Do you know what I mean? So there's that as well. If only bastards join the military, if only psychopaths join the military, is that better or worse? Do you know what I mean? So it's that conundrum. I'm not an advocate for it, but I'm not like an advocate for it because I don't think it's fit for purpose at the moment and what it does. And I think that the military could be better. I think it could be something a lot different. And like, I think that, go on, funny, isn't he? Yeah. And I think that, like, you know, and there's real conversations going on around this right now amongst some of my comrades who are ex-military and involved around the labour and trade movement. Definitely, you know, people have got to understand that the military is not unionised. So there's like, in terms of huge swathes of the MOD have been privatised and set out. It's not been to the benefit of people that have been working in the MOD because it's not. It's not at all. The privatisation of the housing, that, you know, they didn't need to do that because the way the military did it when it was kept in house was that you had people who were living in them houses, looking after them houses and managing them houses, so they really cared about them houses. Whereas, like, when someone's put out to tender in a third-party contract and that, there is a bit of a lack of care. You know, the whole point of like the likes of the Bloody Sunday stuff going on now. You know, you've got guys, you know. And Bloody Sunday is a bizarre case, but you have people being prosecuted. They're trying to prosecute people for stuff in Northern Ireland that happened decades ago. But what they're not doing is they're not going after the policymakers who wrote down the doctrine that set the scene and the tone of these operations. So what they're doing is that, you know, what they've done is that basically is that the scapegoating people who did the dirty work, but not the people who wrote the policies. And it's the, you know, and the thing is, if the military was unionised, you could protect against this sort of violation of policy because the, you know, people of the whistleblower would have legal protection, you know, separate to the MOD. And I'm pretty sure there's plenty to whistleblow on, if I'm honest. Also, is that like, what's our military for now at the moment? It's just a corporate army, or use them, you know, and then to just a private industry. It's like if they went to war with Iran, I think it would be disastrous, if I'm honest. I think what the military should be is that we should be a secure disaster relief organisation. I think that the infantry should be amalgamated with the engineers. There should be some restructuring around it. We should be able to go in somewhere, secure it, and then build the basic infrastructure on the ground as it stands. You know, and provide water and, you know, aid stuff. Do you know what I mean? And police it. I have no issues with this type of military being integrated into the emergency services. Not alongside the likes of the fire brigade and the police and the paramedic and the ambulance service and the NHS and the border control, immigration, and that they get moved through these organisations and rotated, so that like next time we have a pandemic or something, we have like a built-in way to instantly integrate with these services, like the military's being done, well, with what they're trying to do now. But we should be trained for the stuff anyway. Everybody should be able to do the disaster relief, and I don't see why we shouldn't be training people to do this. And you know, that's what I think. I wouldn't say that we get rid of any of the expeditionary elements. So that's like the aircraft carriers and the stuff that you send abroad, you know, because we have colonies, and people will laugh and like get on the thing and say, you know, why are you saying that we shouldn't just give these colonies back? And I'm saying that because I'm a democratic socialist. And if somebody has a referendum and they no longer want to be part of the UK, that is fine. But if you've got countries like a place like Gibraltar and the Falklands where they've had a referendum and they've turned around and said we want to stay part of the UK. So, all right, so we've had you for like hundreds of years. We've utterly exploited your small patch of land or island and used it for whatever. But now we don't need you. We're just going to get rid of you. And there's an economy based in that place that's centered around the military, believe it or not. And you know, how would you replace that? What would you do with it? Is it necessarily bad if the military's there to do disaster relief for the UN? You know, so should we be changing the nature of it all? Yeah, definitely. You know, should we get rid of the military? I don't think that we should get rid of it. I think we should just change it so that it's something better. You know, and something that's there to help humanity as opposed to like, you know, just steal land for corporations and resources. I think Olivia's asking me if I found peace with my time in war now. No, never going to find that. No one's going to find that. I don't understand that. It's, you know, when you find out that you've been part of something that was like really, really bad and really, really wrong, and you had a zealot-like attitude towards it, you know, it's quite hard to square the circle on that. I mean, I was a zealot, you know, and I like to think that I like to say that I'm a good guy. I think I'm better. I don't think I'm that good. But like, you know, there was a time when, like, if they'd asked me to go into that village and shoot everybody, I probably would have done. So, you know, I can't turn around and say that, like, I'm at ease with my character. I do know that there was strong elements of the conditioning process, but also my willingness to embrace it. There's probably a lot of, like, reasons down to that, like, you know, which you could go into the deep and psychological or what have you. But like, I do have moral injury, which is like, and I managed post-traumatic. Well, I'll say I managed post-traumatic stress. So I manage it quite well, to be honest. I don't really. I've worked through the post-traumatic stress disorder type stuff, and I was lucky that I didn't actually shoot anybody. But I did build like the airstrips that drones took off and landed from. And like, you know, when you read about the stats around the drones and that, like, you just think, oh my God, I helped do that. And you know, there was I spent a lot of time and spent a significant period of time in a minefield in a place called 𝗗𝗓𝗂𝗃𝗃 on a job, and like it was only a short period, but there's a film called 𝗗𝗓𝗃𝗃, I think it's on Netflix now. Watch 𝗗𝗓𝗃𝗃, and that was basically sort of around where I was working, and I was doing a survey on a minefield there, and well, I say it was a minefield that wasn't cleared. I don't know if there's any mines there or not. It just said that there might be. But you know, the whole fact that like we took part in what was essentially a form of industrialized corporate murder. You know, you make comparisons with yourself. Well, I do. You know, am I any better than a Nazi? Do you know what I mean? I mean, theirs was a lot more sort of like constructed and funnily did a lot more damage. But we basically the war industry itself basically chews up people. Like you know, the civilian casualty rates are always really ridiculously high. You know, so you know the people who lose out in wars and war zones more than anyone is civilians. More civilians get killed than anybody else. So I don't feel good about that. You know, I don't feel good about helping to support any of it. But you know, I try and work now to try and live a meaningful life, and try and do, you know, that I survived the war for a reason, just to live a meaningful life, and to try and warn against these sorts of things, and try and help other veterans who've come back from this stuff and trying to find meaning for themselves, you know, it's just to basically keep living. You know, so we have the highest suicide rate out of any demographic. But yeah, you know, there you go. Oh, Pam's gone. Well, so if anyone wants to ask anything else, you can you know, ask it, or do you want to call the meeting an end there, or have you got anything for me?
I think we'll ask it, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put this YouTube on this video on YouTube, sorry, so we can continue any discussions there. And if anyone has any extra questions that you want to ask anonymously, then I'll bounce them to Dave. Thank you so much for that. You definitely you didn't leave the tears out of it right at the end. You definitely got us. So well done. And yeah, I definitely want to summarize that and just say, you know, it really is amazing that you are so transparent and open about your experience, and it really is powerful to us. And as you can see, people thanking you now in the comments, so just thank you for not only your service but for your new formation of service that you are creating and doing and living now via ways such as this webinar and your public speaking and just activism. So thank you. Right, I'll round up by shouting out CND. Thank you so much for helping us do this webinar series. And we're going to be sending out a summary email which will have a donation option for us, 𝗵𝗂𝗃𝗓. We're a community of Monday peacemakers, and 2 for CND, who are finding it very hard to do their normal activism campaigning against nuclear weapons because of COVID. So if you can donate at all, that would be amazing. If not, no worries. You can just connect with us and watch the whole series that we have been putting on over the past few weeks via our YouTube. So look out for that email. And yeah, just thank you all so much for being a part of this series. And thank you once again to Dave for that truly insightful, amazing talk on your experience as a veteran of how war affects the environment. So
thank you.
Yeah, with that we'll hang up on you. I'll just read out a few of the thank yous. Thank you so much, Pam. Fascinating.
Okay. I'm going to stop then. Okay, thank you.
And yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Bye-bye.